much. It's a pleasure to be here. It was my pleasure to actually attend the lecture this afternoon. It was a very interesting discussion about eyewitness survivor testimony, and I know you're in store for a wonderful lecture tonight as well. So again, in order to get CLE credit, and I guess if you want to sign up, I was raising her hand there, so you can sign up for CLE credit. And in order to do so, I want to give it a little bit of a kind of legal flavor to the discussion. So to the extent that some of you are lawyers or you're not lawyers, one of the things I thought about was that tonight's lecture, thinking about sort of Eichmann's own testimony, is really what we think of as a confession, right? And so what we know about confessions, we think about in the law self-incrimination. And self-incrimination is a right, a constitutional right that comes from the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. And one of the things to think about is sort of why do we have this right against self-incrimination? Why is it that somebody can come up and say, yeah, I did it, right? And of course we can, right? We often do have people confessing, but having the state compel one to have to incriminate themselves is a policy that we feel in the United States is not something that we want to enforce. And so thinking about sort of why that is and what kind of protections we have to make that whole. So of course many people are very familiar with Miranda, right? The Miranda rights are actually, they come from that Fifth Amendment right not to incriminate yourself. And really what that is telling you how this information will be used against you. Because it's not really about the reliability of the information, right? It could be, very reliable and corroborated and checked out, but still, under the Constitution, we won't allow that evidence into court. And so, it's interesting, we can have a whole discussion about reliability of confessions, and there's a whole science of extracting confessions from people. Police will sort of undergo training, and there's manuals, and there's all sorts of techniques. Some people may be familiar with good cop, bad cop, etc. And so, there's many different aspects to it. But also one may think about sort of why do we want people to sort of answer, right, for what they've done. And in other systems, in a system of sort of restorative justice where it's more of a circle process that tribal and indigenous people use, right? It's important to sort of have that airing of what one did. And so thinking about why in our system do we value certain things and not others, and what is the significance of one's admitting one's crime. And so, with that thought in mind, I know we're going to hear a very interesting lecture, and I will introduce our speaker, Professor Christopher Browning, who received his bachelor's degree from Oberlin College and his doctorate degree from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. He taught at the Pacific Lutheran University and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He was also elected as a fellow with the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he is a prolific scholar in the area of Holocaust studies. So I won't take the time to go through all of his many publications and talks that he's done, because then we wouldn't have time to give a lecture. But I do want to mention one of his most significant books. One in 1992, Ordinary Men, the Reserve Police Battalion 101, and the Final Solution in Poland. And that was about a police battalion in Poland where otherwise ordinary citizens were really turned into sort of executioners and very brutal killers. And this book influenced the later studies called the Milgram experiments, where people, where it was seen that ordinary people could be subject to sort of authority, obedience to authority, and would actually shock other people that they didn't know, Confederates in the study. And so his work in Holocaust studies was actually credited with sort of spurring that research. And also a book that really inspired his talk this afternoon, Remembering Survival, Inside a Nazi Slave Labor Camp. And for that he earned the 2011 Yad Vashem International Book Prize for Holocaust Research. So I think both those books are, and his other books as well, are probably well worth a read. And I will turn over to hear the lecture for tonight, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Cheryl, and thank you, Alyssa, for hosting me in today's lectures. Tonight I did want to talk about Adolf Eichmann, and of course he has been a kind of lightning rod for controversy, seen generally as a symbol of Holocaust evil. The controversy is what kind of evil did he represent? And of course at one extreme we have Hannah Arendt, who said that Eichmann, and I will quote her, posed the dilemma between the unspeakable horror of the deeds and the undeniable ludicrousness of the man who perpetrated them, and that this gulf could only be solved by understanding him as an exemplar of what she called the banality of evil. Now, she wasn't saying the Holocaust was a banal evil. She was saying the man who committed this terrible evil was banal. There was this terrible disproportion between the character of the man who was the chief perpetrator and the results that he achieved. On the other end of the spectrum, my friend and colleague from Israel, Yaakov Bozovic, characterized Eichmann as not the commonplace kinds of evil that we so often meet in ordinary life. The evil produced by indifference, selfishness, heartlessness, thoughtlessness in the face of the harm that we do to others. But rather that Eichmann was a man who consciously and purposely maximized the harm that he did to his targets. This was a willful and purposeful maximization of evil, nothing careless or ordinary about it. So we have these extremes of how we characterize Eichmann as a symbol of Holocaust evil. For the record, I would say that I consider Hannah Arendt's concept of banality of evil an important insight for understanding many Holocaust perpetrators, but not Eichmann himself. Right concept, wrong person. I think she was too critical in accepting Eichmann's self-defense strategy after his capture, precisely because there were so many perpetrators that were of the kind that Eichmann was pretending to be, that is the pedantic and banal, ordinary bureaucrat. However, tonight I'm not here mainly to talk about Eichmann as a symbol of evil and what kind of evil that was, but rather to look at a different topic, and that is to examine the voluminous post-war testimonies that Eichmann gave. And that to look at these both in terms of self-representation at different stages of his post-war career, of his defense strategy. The person who has written the major book on this, which you can see downstairs, is Eichmann Before Jerusalem by Bettina Stengnath, a German writer. And she took the position that we learn nothing new from historical insight from these testimonies, but we do learn a great deal about Eichmann's mind, about how Eichmann thought, and how he was trying to falsify history and trying to represent himself. I will be arguing tonight that that's a bit too simple, that indeed these testimonies are crucial for understanding Eichmann's mind. But I will also be arguing that in spite of himself, Eichmann revealed some important historical truths which we would know nothing about without his testimony, simply because he talked so much and for so long and wrote so much that even inadvertently he engaged in self-incrimination even while he was trying to engage in self-apology. And so I will look at these various stages and see how that works out. Now, basically, we divide the post-war testimonies of Eichmann into two groups. One is the pre-capture group of testimonies, and the other is the post-capture. And they all, of course, have very different characters. We used to refer to the pre-capture documents as the Sassen tapes or the Sassen interviews. But thanks to Bettina Stengnath, we now know that they're much more extensive than that. So we now use her term, the Argentine papers. What did he produce when he was in Argentina? In fact, these include more than the Sassen tapes. As he was preparing to give this series of presentations at Sassen's house from the spring to fall of 1957, he in fact wrote some preparatory memoranda. We know he read various books that were just beginning to come out on the Holocaust and underlined and made marginalia notes, challenging or whatever those who were writing about it. Then we have the presentations he himself made. Sassen, in a sense, had a kind of salon, and every week a number of Nazis, neo-Nazis, and sympathizers in the Argentine area would come. Eichmann was not the only one there making presentations, but he was the star. And so he is certainly the one who is the most dominant figure there. But this was a kind of neo-Nazi coffee klatch in which they got together weekly and gave presentations about what was emerging as an awareness that the Holocaust presented a real challenge to neo-Nazis who were still dreaming that somehow the verdict of World War II could be reversed and were still living in a kind of unreal world at that point where they thought that they could undo the Bundesrepublik in the same way that the Weimar Republic had come crashing down earlier. So he wrote two in particular key memoranda in preparation. One he entitled "The Other Spoke, Now I Want to Speak." This was his response to initial books that he was reading. And then another entitled "My Findings on the Jewish Question." And then, as I say, for a whole series of months, from spring to fall of '57, he gave these talks, and they were being taped. And then the tapes were being transcribed by amateur transcribers. And some of the tapes were then erased and reused, taped over. So the tapes do not represent the full set of transcripts, but they at least allow us to verify the transcripts where, in fact, we have both transcript and tape side by side. Then this bundle of so-called Argentine papers fragmented and followed a number of different courses. And if you'll bear with me, I'll try to show why historians couldn't really work with this material for so long, because it got splintered and was sent in different directions. Sassen himself took part of the Argentine papers, not all, and in 1960, after the capture, peddled them to Stern magazine in Germany and Life magazine in the United States, which each produced a two-part series in Life magazine, a four-part series in Stern. And got money for that. A second, though not identical, selection from the total seems to have been in the possession of Eichmann's brother, and it was stolen from his office and then sent and reproduced, copied, one version of which seemed to have ended up in Warsaw, where the most extensive 1960 reproduction took place, but it was in Polish and nobody paid attention, and that remained totally anonymous. And a third partial selection from the Argentine papers made their way in the spring of 1961 to Gideon Hausner and those preparing the prosecution in Israel. To this day, nobody has admitted quite how they got it, but at least the most educated guess is that Simon Wiesenthal got his hands on some portion and forwarded it to them. So in the courtroom in preparation for the trial, it was just one of three incomplete sets, probably the least complete set that showed up in Jerusalem, where for Eichmann and his attorney, Robert Savatius, they now had to try to discredit it as best they could. And so Eichmann described this as, quote, pub talk. The Wilhelm Sassen, a Dutch SS man turned journalist, he said, was interviewing him, plying him with alcohol, inciting to give more sensational accounts, and then falsified and exaggerated even what he had written down. So he said all these transcripts, the partial transcripts that Hausner had, he said were all fake and had no value as evidence in a courtroom. And the result was that in Israel, the only portions of that portion of the Argentine papers that could be used in evidence were the pages on which you had Eichmann's own handwritten corrections. He had clearly seen it, and corrected what he thought were errors. And having done that, he could no longer claim that these were forgeries or distorted or didn't represent what he thought. So a teeny fraction of one portion of the Argentine papers could be used in the courtroom in Israel, but a very small, very minute portion of the whole. In the 1970s, probably the Stern Life group got returned to Vera Eichmann because she ultimately had the rights to it, and she sold it to Druffel Verlag, a neo-Nazi press in Germany, that commissioned Rudolf Aschenauer, a neo-Nazi lawyer who made his career out of defending accused Nazis in various courts in Germany, to edit it and publish it. And this came out as Adolf Eichmann, Adolf Eichmann, in the late 1970s or early 80s. We don't know what Vera Eichmann may have taken out of them, but we do know very clearly that Aschenauer distorted them tremendously. Of all the various versions out there, Adolf Eichmann, published by Druffel Verlag, edited by Rudolf Aschenauer, is the most distorted and historically the most worthless as an historical source. Finally, over the course, or I should say one last version popped up when David Irving was in Buenos Aires giving his many talks to sympathetic audiences. Somebody handed him a bundle of papers, which turned out to be yet another partial collection of this, and he took it to the Bundesarchiv in Germany and gave it to them. And in the 90s, all of these different versions, in one way or another, reached the Bundesarchiv, where the archivists initially looked at them and said, oh, they're all duplicates, and never examined how they might be different from one another. And it was only then when Irma Wojcik, or should I say, the next thing they got was the tapes. A Nazi memorabilia collector in Switzerland had the actual cassettes. And when they got those, then it was possible for an historian to actually listen and read, verify that these may have been non-professional transcripts, but they were authentic transcripts. These were not falsifications, not distortions, and that they were true transcripts, but so unprofessional that the transcriber didn't note when a different person was speaking. So some of the transcripts, in fact, are not Adolf Eichmann, and we didn't know that until you actually listened to the voices. And two German historians, Irma Wojcik and Bettina Stengneth, basically did that horrifically laborious task of listening to all the tapes, comparing them to the transcripts, and thus sorting out that the different collections they had were not identical, and that there were different partial collections that were now at last reassembled. So in the Federal Archives in Germany, we now have the complete Argentine papers that for the first time that in fact one could work with as a complete collection. So that's one reason why this hasn't been worked with before. They didn't get reassembled in the 90s, they didn't get verified until the late 90s, early turn of the next century, and only now have several people done that horrific task of sort of working through and going through all of it. What do we learn? Who is the Eichmann that appears in the Argentine papers? Well, first from the preparatory memos that I mentioned, what we see is Eichmann presenting himself as a dyed-in-the-wool Nazi ideologue, that he basically embraces and internalizes hardcore Nazi anti-Semitic and racial ideology. He sets out as his premise that it was not Poland or Germany that started the war, but the Jews. This is straight out of Hitler himself. That therefore World War II was an existential struggle for survival of Germans who were threatened with destruction by the Jews. It was a total and a racial war. The Jews were the aggressor, Germany were the victims, and his conscience was answerable only to, quote, the voice of blood, German race, and to higher orders. And thus, and I quote, this is Eichmann himself, I am not guilty before the law and before my conscience, he wrote. What is right is what aids the people, meaning, of course, the German people. So he comes in, basically, as having internalized the core of Nazi ideology and clinging to it and presenting that in his preparatory memorandum. At the meetings at Sassen's house, it turns out that Sassen had a different agenda. Sassen is now what we would call engaging in a project of Nazi normalization and Holocaust denial. How to sanitize Hitler and make Nazism seem sellable, presentable again. And therefore, he wanted to enlist Eichmann in the cause of Holocaust denial. One, that Hitler hadn't given the order, Eichmann had done this on his own. And two, that the numbers of Jews killed were minuscule, nothing anywhere close to approaching the 6 million. In this regard, Sassen is terribly disappointed because Eichmann does not throw himself on the sword in the service of Holocaust denial. Quite the contrary. He insists that Hitler, of course, gave the orders and made the decisions for the final solution. And of course, they did not fail in killing millions of Jews. How could anybody suggest they had been so inefficient? As he put it, quote, "When I received an order, I always carried out this order, and I am proud of that to this day. If I had not done this, they would not have gone to the butcher. Of course I sent them off to their death." Concerning the deportation of 400,000 Jews from Hungary in less than 2 months, he posted, quote, "It was actually an achievement that was never matched before or since." He's proud of it. Here's somebody trying to minimize it. You didn't kill that many Jews, and he's saying, no, I did it. That he isn't going to minimize the final solution of the Holocaust for the sake of Sassen's political agenda. As the meetings near their end, the most important single meeting, he gives a kind of summary speech in which he characterizes himself both as kind of the ambiguity, both a cautious bureaucrat and, quote, a fanatical warrior. He continues, quote, again, this comes from his words, "I must tell you I have no regrets. It would have been easy to tell you quite honestly, I'm sorry, I'm getting lost here. I have no regrets. It would be too easy for me to deeply regret it, for me to pretend to be a Saul who has become a Paul. No, I have to tell you quite honestly that if of the 10.3 million Jews that Cohen identified, here is referring, Cohen was Himmler's statistician, and if you know the Wannsee Conference report, they in fact had a list of 11 million Jews that they were targeted. They included, of course, France, Algeria, Scandinavia, England, Ireland, and all over. I have to tell you quite honestly that if of the 10.3 million Jews that Cohen identified, we had killed 10.3 million, I would be satisfied and would say, good, we have destroyed an enemy. We would have fulfilled our duty to our blood and our people and to the freedom of peoples if we had exterminated the most cunning intellect of all human intellects alive today. For that is what I have always preached. We are fighting an enemy who is intellectually superior to us, referring to the Jews. And you must understand that it is my motivation when I say if 10.3 million of these enemies had been killed, then we would have fulfilled our duty. And of course, he didn't kill 10.3 million. He had said during the war he had jumped into his grave laughing because he had killed 5 million. But he ends on a kind of note of apology. In truth, if I could have done more, he says, in truth, I could have done more and should have done more. And he blamed himself in part. I lacked the necessary physical toughness, he said. He hadn't been as tough as other SS butchers. And then a complaint he always comes back to. And then I was curtailed in carrying out the other things that would have helped me to break through, because for many years I was bogged down in the struggle against the so-called interventionists. He is constantly complaining that if they'd only left him to do it alone, he could have, but all these other bureaucrats and other people from the Foreign Office to the Interior Ministry to the railways wouldn't play ball, they always obstructed. And he's always complaining about the people who intervened to make his job harder. Poor Adolf, people weren't helping him. Then, of course, he is arrested and taken to Israel. And we have the second group of testimonies, the post-capture testimonies. And these are very extensive too. And basically, they come in a number of parts. First of all, he was going to be interrogated by Avner Less for 38 days. And these interrogations take up something like 3,500 typed pages. In the middle of that interrogation, Avner Less urged him to write his own memoirs. And then after interrogation days, he would go home to his cell, and he wrote a 129-page handwritten, quote, meine Memoiren. Thirdly, of course, he gives testimony in court and is cross-examined. Fourthly, he is writing notes to his defense attorney, Robert Servatius, and Servatius turned his papers over to the National Archives in Germany. So we have a number of handwritten things that Eichmann himself wrote on behalf of or in communication with his attorney. And then after the conviction, he goes back to his cell. His conviction is on appeal. And now he sits down with the 1,600 documents that now he has access to that were used as documents in the trial, and writes a second memoir. The first one's 129 pages, this one's 450 pages, with footnotes. You don't often get a war criminal writing his memoirs with footnotes. This was my colleague Christian Gerlach to kind of remark bitterly, Eichmann, our colleague, Eichmann the footnoter, and that he was not made very happy by that. What is important about this last group the last memoir, that's 450, 60 pages with footnotes and about 700 pages of notes, the whole thing comes to close to 1,300 or 1,400 pages, is that it was kept secret. It remained in the custody in Israel, but was not made public. And it was only when the Lipstadt-Irving trial was about to begin, and there were rumors about its existence, that Israel decided they had to release it because they feared that David Irving would cite Israel suppressing evidence as part of covering up the Holocaust. And so this was all released in the spring of 2000 on the eve of Deborah Lipstadt's defense against Irving's libel suit. And the justification the Israelis had given is they, quote, didn't want to give Eichmann the last word, that he shouldn't be able to, having given his testimony in court, be allowed in another round of self-justification. Well, how do these post-capture testimonies differ from the earlier ones? The earlier ones we see he's quite open about his Nazi ideology, proud of what he has done, and certainly is not going to support the denier agenda that Hitler didn't order it or that they didn't kill millions of Jews. In the post-war, post-capture collection, of course, now his testimony turned into a self-defense strategy. How does he minimize himself? And how does he represent himself in a very different way? And I would say there are three kind of colossal lies at the heart of the post-war testimonies, and which are now at the heart of Eichmann's new self-representation. The first is his claim that he was not an anti-Semite. As he tells Avner Less, quote, personally, I have no hatred against the Jews. And nothing personal, I just killed 6 men, I helped kill 6 million, but don't take it personally. And his way of claiming that he was not an anti-Semite was not, of course, to claim he didn't write the various memoranda he did and so forth, but to cite various little anecdotes. His father had Jewish friends, and he had played with the children of his father's Jewish friends. His stepmother had Jewish in-laws, and he had even kissed a Jewish cousin on the cheek. How could he be a mass murderer? He had kissed a half-Jewish cousin. Then he sat at a cafe with a Jewish acquaintance, even while he was wearing his Nazi pin. So how could anybody like that possibly be an anti-Semite? I mean, he reduced the issue of being an anti-Semite to them. If you want an example of banality, this is the most banal kind of excuse that you could have, citing these petty anecdotes from his life to prove that he was not fundamentally anti-Semite. And even claimed when he was, of course, manipulating various Jewish leaders, that he was working on the same footing and they operated as colleagues and equals. Of course, their story of this, insofar as they survived, is quite opposite of that. So one great lie was his attempt to claim he was not an anti-Semite and that none of this was based on any personal hatred of Jews. The second great lie was to proclaim himself an idealist, and indeed an idealist who was practically a Zionist. That his whole life had been devoted to finding territory to be put under the feet of the Jews. And I'm here, I'll quote, my sole endeavor was to make some suggestion or other that somewhere land be placed under the feet of the Jews. But again, the interventionists, his competition in the Nazi bureaucracy had always thwarted him. He was always trying to aid Jews to emigrate. We would call it ethnic cleansing or expulsion, but he now portrayed himself as a lifesaver trying to help Jews to emigrate. and that even with the outbreak of the war, he said he gave birth to three great ideas. One was that there should be an autonomous, self-governing state for the Jews in Poland. This was going to be the Lublin Reservation. When another Nazi described the Lublin Reservation, he said this was an ideal place for a Jewish reservation. The swampy area would guarantee a vast decimation of Jewish life. But Eichmann's post-war version, of course, this was going to be a self-governing state where the Jews lived on their own territory. When that was ruined by Hans Frank, the governor of Poland, who would cooperate. So he then said he dreamed up the Madagascar plan. The Jews could go to Madagascar and have their own state. The fact that his own documents describe Madagascar as a super ghetto, he managed to conveniently forget and to say, no, this was to be their own free country. And then after that, he proclaimed that Theresienstadt was to have a vast hinterland, and the Jews of Czechoslovakia should have their own state there. But then the bureaucrats in Czechoslovakia wouldn't grant the hinterland, and the German Nazis all insisted their Jews should be dumped there too. So what you ended up was a vastly overcrowded ghetto that was a way station to Auschwitz, none of which, quote, he ever, of course, intended or planned. But when these three great ideas, as he called them, failed, his dream and last hope, that's his own words, were shattered, and henceforth he was, quote, simply a tool in the hands of stronger powers and stronger forces, and of an inexorable fate. His third great lie was from that point on, he did nothing at all. He was utterly passive, he took no initiatives, made no decisions, and simply obeyed orders. His superiors decided when and where Jews should be killed, that basically collaborator regimes rounded up their Jews and turned them over to the Germans. His subordinates scheduled the trains, and it was not his group in the SS, but the Economic Administrative Office of the Security Police that ran Auschwitz and the death camps who did the killing. He just watched the paper pass and forth, never did a thing, totally passive, non-active. He never participated in the killing of Jews. In addition to these sort of big fabrications, when presented with actual documents, one after another that was incriminating, he engaged in what we would now call the fake news defense. They're all forgeries, they're all fake, and simply disputed facts were not facts, and that was sort of Eichmann's defense there. So that's what he built up during the trial. Obviously, it was not terribly persuasive. And then when the trial is over and he's awaiting the verdict of the appeal, and he has the chance to write his last massive memoir with the aid of the documents, so he's going to footnote all of this. He entitles this Götzen, which in German means idols or false gods, and he now takes a confessional approach. He now has seen the light. He was misled by the false gods of nationalism. His loyalty to his leaders was misused. He is the victim who has been exploited and manipulated by leaders who have misused him. He now believes in international brotherhood and reconciliation and peace to all nations. And if the Israelis will only let him go, he will be on a mission to the world. But of course, why is that not going to happen? Because the vengeful Jews are going to hang him. In the end, he has an anti-Semitic twist to even his attempt to portray himself as a convert to reconciliation and international brotherhood. He's attempting to manipulate to the very end before he is hung. For the historian looking at this, and this is where I disagree with Bettina Spengler, is it possible to find historically useful testimony in this sludge of mendacity? I mean, we know the first part is very good on telling us what Eichmann felt, and he can basically confesses to be a true believing Nazi, but he doesn't say much in terms of new information. It's important about his attitude. He is yet very vague on details. He doesn't have documents and that sort of thing. He's not being presented with specific questions. He's talking to a neo-Nazi group giving kind of pep talks. In custody, of course, now he's dealing with documents and trying to deny or to explain away or reframe various events. And he is interested in the actual historical events, even if he wants to either claim the documents are forgeries or to put them in a different framework. And the question is, can the historian reading through this mass material gain any new insights, learn something that we didn't know before, that can become part, in a sense, of the historical record, in spite of Eichmann, in spite of himself. After all, if you remember, of course, the top leaders are all dead. The only living witness in the 1960s to what was going on at the center of the government in terms of Jewish policy, of what's happening with Reinhard Heydrich, Heinrich Müller, Heinrich Himmler, and so forth, is Eichmann. He had the bird's eye seat. And so if in fact we can utilize his vantage point, and in fact he reveals things he didn't realize he was doing, then indeed there can be something to gain. And the question is, how would one sort through all the lies to find out what might be useful? And in looking at this stuff, I, in a sense, came up with what I would call sort of a fourfold test as to whether any of this information he gives is useful to us. One is what I would call the possibility test. Is what he is saying possibly true? If we have any documents that obviously contradict it, then it's not possible, and we can dismiss it. The second is the probability test. Do other documents, in fact, create for us a pattern of events that coincides with what he's telling us? Does he, in fact, fit into, even if he's adding to what we know? Is it plausible because it is, in fact, an expansion of and giving us more detail about something we already knew, but Eichmann, because of his special vantage point, is helping us to know even more about that. And the third I would give is the self-interest test. Is what he is saying against his self-interest? Or in certain cases, which I'll try to point out, is it in his self-interest to in fact tell the truth? And occasionally, there were points in the trial where it was in his self-interest to tell the truth, because he was confronting other testimony that was false, and he was trying to set the record straight. Particularly the testimony of Rudolf Perss, the commandant of Auschwitz, who wrote a very confused memoir himself in Polish prison before he was accusing Eichmann of lots of things and telescoping the chronology of 1941-42, which Eichmann then desperately wants to unpack and disprove to Sovietius. And what's at the core of some of the things he writes to his defense attorney is he says, why am I so careful in trying to get this straight? Because I must prove Hearst the arch liar. And here's Eichmann actually trying to sort out the truth, and it's in his interest to do so. And finally, what I would call the vividness test. Are these testimonies, does he tell these stories as a kind of formulaic recitation, or does it include visual details that shows he's actually recalling something? And that the way in which he tells the story does seem to indicate that he's really, in his mind, seeing something and not just carrying out a kind of minimal recitation as yet another lie. Well, I would just, can't of course go through all of the hundreds of pages in which we can find, I think, interesting nuggets among the sludge. But there are four things, I would say, where Eichmann gives us accounts of himself that we would not know except for his testimony. And I would then try to show why, in fact, this is not unimportant and why it helps to disprove Eichmann's own defense theory and, in fact, alters the story that he is trying to tell. What are these four events that he tells us that we couldn't possibly know except for having Eichmann himself in one of these post-capture testimonies, and usually in sequencing all of them, repeating the story? The first has to do with his going in the fall of 1941, being summoned to Reinhard Heydrich, where Reinhard Heydrich tells him the Fuhrer has decided on the destruction of the European Jews, physical destruction, and wants him to go to Poland, to the higher SS police leader in the Lublin district, Blachnik. And he says, according to Eichmann, Blachnik is making preparations to use anti-tank ditches. Of course, along the Lublin border was the demarcation line before 1941 between the Soviet annexations of Poland and the German, and the early labor camps had been there digging fortifications. This would be a place where you'd have mass trenches that could be used as mass graves, and that's what Eichmann thought he was going to visit. And Eichmann goes there, and he says he was driven out of Lublin for about an hour and a half, and came to a little hut on the side of the road where he's met by a police captain whose name he later recalls, because it's in the documents, Christian Wirth, the man who later becomes the head of Operation Reinhardt. They go on a small path into the forest where Wirth shows him two peasant huts that are being sealed up in preparation for a test of using exhaust gas from motors to kill people. The T4 program, the killing of the mentally ill in Germany, had been used with cylinders of pure carbon monoxide. What the Nazis were doing in September 41 is experimenting with whether everywhere available ordinary exhaust gas from internal combustion engines can do the same thing, and this is going to be one of the first tests of that. And Eichmann doesn't give us an exact date, but he says afterwards he came back and reported to Heydrich in Berlin. Heydrich, we know, was in Berlin between September 24 and September 27. He'd been reassigned to the Protectorate and was briefly back in Berlin. He says the fall colors were at their height. We know it was very early fall, and that this would have been right for that as well. And that Eichmann, in his own reason, telling us, is that he's so relieved that he didn't have to watch executions in the anti-tank ditches, and that the gas chambers weren't operating yet, because of course he was much too squeamish to possibly have been able to stand that. And how relieved a man of his weak physical stature, a man who had never been a mass murderer, didn't have to see any of this when he was sent there. His agenda is quite different, but the details he gives us are extraordinary. Something we could never have known without that testimony. He then goes on to say the next that he's sent by Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo, to witness an execution in Minsk. And that he gets there, he hesitates, waits till the last round, goes, stands at the edge of the pit, and is so close that the brains of the Jewish child that is shot splatters his winter coat. It's cold out, he knows it's winter by now, and his chauffeur cleans off his coat, and he is so upset, so distraught, that he drinks himself silly in the car all the way back to Berlin. Once again, his agenda, I'm so weak I couldn't see this without drinking myself into a stupor. He is then sent to Helmand. This is the first death camp outside Lodz, or Łódź, where the first death camp was put into operation on December 8th of 1941. He says he went there before the Wannsee Conference, which is January 20th, so he's going there at the very early stage. And he witnesses the whole operation. He's to report back again to Müller on it. And again, he tells us, oh, the man wanted me to look through the peephole to watch the people being asphyxiated. And he said, of course, I couldn't do it, but I couldn't help but be there when they opened the doors and the dead bodies piled out and they came in with their pliers to yank gold teeth. And he said it was the most horrible thing he's ever seen in his life, and he practically fainted. Once again, his agenda is that, he was totally unsuited for this. And then the last one is his argument over when he first went to Auschwitz and witnessed gassing there. Rudolf Hirsch, the man who was the commandant at Auschwitz, in his memoir claimed that Eichmann came to Auschwitz in summer of 1941, explained to Hirsch that the killing with firing squads was getting too burdensome on the men. They were going to have to do something else with gas, and that in fact Eichmann walked with him around the camp to find the sites of the gas chambers, and they discussed the various kinds of gas. And of course, at Auschwitz they decided on Zyklon B, the disinfectant, as opposed to the carbon monoxide. Eichmann was confronted, hadn't seen this earlier, in the middle of the Less interrogations. Less gives him this page to read. And Eichmann, who thought Hirsch was his friend, now feels totally betrayed, goes berserk, and now is on a mission to discredit Hirsch's testimony. Historians now don't believe Hirsch. Hirsch was telescoping what happened in 41-42. None of this happened in 41. Later in 42, they do decide on building large gas chambers in Auschwitz, and this is a visit by Himmler, not by Eichmann, in July of 42 that sets that on its course. But before that, they were already experimenting. And that we do know, even from the fall of 41 in the morgue in Auschwitz I, they were testing Zyklon B. And then in the spring of 42, they sealed, like what Washington was doing for the test in Lublin, a peasant hut outside Birkenau was then sealed up as became Bunker 1, and later they did a second Bunker 2, where the gassing at Auschwitz from the spring of 42 until the spring of 43, when the new modern gas chamber crematoria came online, was where the gassing at Auschwitz took place. And in fact, the first major gassing there, we now know, are the Silesian Jews between May 5th and May 12th. Major deportations of Jews from Dubrovka and Sosnovitz are killed. The first, many thousands of Jews killed in mass in Bunker 1 at that date. What does Eichmann say? He says, Hirsch is all wrong. I didn't go to Auschwitz until I saw the gassing in the little hut, where instead of carbon monoxide, they used these little wafers. He's describing Cyclone Bay. And where he said the gassing took place under when the spring was in full bloom, under the cherry blossoms. And this is the May 5th, May 12th gassing that he's looking at. And so, in fact, and as he writes to his period, he makes a complete timeline for Servatius, trying to get the dates in 41, 42 straight, all in order to disprove Hirsch's accusation. And so he's trying to tell the truth, and he's trying to get documents to do that, and as he writes to his attorney, why am I putting so much emphasis on this? Because I have to prove Hirsch the arch liar. Here's a case where it's in Eichmann's interest to get to the truth, and what he gives us, in fact, we now know, fits the truth fairly well. So we have these 4 events, none of which we would know at all, other than that Eichmann gives us these detailed accounts. As I say, one of these is motivated to disprove Hirsch's testimony. The other 3 are motivated to portray himself as this squeamish, weak person who couldn't possibly have been the mass murderer that he's being portrayed as. But what do they in fact show us? At the point that they are doing the very first experiment with carbon monoxide gas for Operation Reinhardt in Poland, who is there? Adolf Eichmann. At the very first city in Russia to which they are sending German Jews in transports, and the way they're going to make room to put them into the Minsk ghetto is to shoot the Minsk Jews first, and to make sure that they shoot the Minsk Jews so they can take in the German Jews. Who is there? Adolf Eichmann. When they start the Chełmno death camp, the first systematic gassing by a death camp of Jews, who is there? Adolf Eichmann. And when they start using Bunker 1 at Birkenau, with Cyclone Bay poisoning, with the first mass deportations to Silesia, who is there? Adolf Eichmann. So this does not prove that he's this minor, inconsequential bureaucrat. He, in fact, has given us an itinerary that places him exactly at the key point of each major escalation of the whole process on behalf of Himmler and Heydrich and Mueller between the fall of 1941 and 42. If ever anybody was incriminated themselves as to their own importance, it was what Eichmann tells us and inadvertently reveals to us if we will read his testimonies carefully and apply our own tests and bring our own knowledge to it. It, in fact, is not something that is worthless. It's not stuff that has no historical significance. It, in fact, is information that carefully used and studied, the historian can learn a great deal from. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. So I know there's probably a lot of questions. I see one back here.
What can you tell us about Eichmann's lawyer? Is there any context you can give us about it?
Yeah, Servatius had, like many, there's a whole cadre of German lawyers who, as very young men, were hired to defend the German accused in the international trial and the subsequent American trials in Nuremberg. Once they had that experience, they had a specialty that no one else had, and that was to defend others subsequently accused. Some of them did it out of a clear neo-Nazi ideological identification, like Rudolf Aschenauer, He is all over Germany defending people, and he's doing it because he is a convinced Nazi trying to get his buddies off. Servatius, I think, is not of that stripe, much more respectable, and that his attempt was, in fact, to get, he helps plan the strategy, let's minimize Eichmann, let's turn him into the minor figure, and try to get into the hurdles, and also trying to assert international law, that these were sovereign acts that other countries don't have a right to judge on. Send him back to Germany for a trial, that's where he can be put on trial, not in Israel. So it was not a Goonish defense. I mean, he basically, I think, did what any attorney would have been obligated to do on behalf of Eichmann, and certainly I don't sense in the papers that he's no Aschenauer that sees this as a Nazi cause.
Was he pro bono or was he paid?
Oh, he was paid. Yeah, he was paid.
Eichmann family?
No, I think he's paid by the state of Israel.
Israel.
Yeah, he's a public defender. In fact, he's hired on behalf by I believe I'm right on this. He's hired. They got to choose. I think the family agreed to choose him, but I believe that the Israelis did pay his fee because they were so anxious to make sure this trial was accepted as a legitimate trial, not a showcase trial. That Eichmann was provided every legal defense that any defendant in any court in the world would have, and so they leaned over backwards to accommodate and to make sure that there was no appearance that they were hindering Eichmann's defense in any way.
So I'm actually going to take moderator's privilege to ask a little bit of a follow-up question.
Yeah.
So to the extent that when the lawyer was defending him, one argument might be that since Eichmann's defense was merely a cog in the wheel here, that having testimony about his ideology or other sort of information that he confessed to might not be as relevant. Were there any objections to this testimony, his prior statements coming in court, and how were those handled in the trial?
Well, of course, Servatius did protest against any of that coming in, and the only parts that could come in were the ones that had his handwriting on it that showed that he had corrected it, and it represented his acceptance that represented what he had said.
So there was no objection to on any other grounds of sort of, that this evidence wasn't relevant or was...
No, there wasn't that it wasn't relevant. It was that it was ineffective. Well, it was, their claim wasn't there that it wasn't authentic or valid representation of what Eichmann thought, because Sassen had basically had his own agenda. And so unless he had corrected it and marked it as correct, you had no way of knowing was it Sassen's testimony or was it his. That could be corrected, they could say this represents what Eichmann has agreed to. And so in that sense, but the trial did not turn on whether Eichmann was sincere. It turned on what he did, not whether he liked doing it or not. So that was not as crucial. It was crucial for historians who wanted to know whose image of Eichmann was more correct, Hannah Arendt's or others. But for the trial itself, it is the act of organizing the trains and sending people to death camps and knowing when he sends them there. And this, of course, is part of the confession that when he says, they brought me in the fall of 1941 and told me that Hitler decided on the physical destruction of Jews. This is crucial in another regard because almost every other German who's involved in deportation says, well, I put them on the trains, but I didn't know they were being sent to kill. I thought they were going to grow cabbages in Poland and war camps and whatever. How could I possibly know they were going to put them in gas chambers? And they don't admit to knowing the fate of the Jews until it can be proven beyond any doubt. Their defense is always ignorance, because particularly in Germany, deprivation of freedom was past the statute of limitations. So rounding them up, taking away their freedom, and sending them to a camp in the East wasn't even prosecutable after 1960-61 in Germany. But in Israel, of course, this is being done not under German law. And the judge actually says to him, you do realize that you have admitted that all the German Jews you sent to Lodz ghetto in the fall, even though they're not killed until the next spring, you knew they were being sent to be killed. And he says, yes, he does. So that was very crucial in his admission of knowledge, that when he put people on the trains in the fall, even though no death camps to send them to yet, he was in fact abetting and preparing for what he knew was going to happen.
In the back.
Has any German of any high rank ever admitted responsibility and taken responsibility in any of these trials, either in Germany or in Nuremberg or subsequently?
Well, I certainly have, I would say, let me see how I should phrase this. They certainly have given accounts that turned out to be self-incriminating. They usually are coupled with attempts to shape it in terms of offenses that will get them off, such as, yes, I admit that I took 1,000 Jews from Cologne and put them on the train, but that's not murder because I'm not guilty of accessory murder because I didn't know they were being sent to be murdered. An accessory has to be conscious. You can't be an accessory if you don't know what you're doing is aiding and abetting somebody else's killing them. So usually their lawyers are very careful to advise them to what they can confess to preserve credibility, but what they can't confess to, because that would get them in trouble with German law, where the division is between what's prosecutable and what isn't.
But nobody pled guilty and said this was a horrible crime.
No, I don't think you get this. What you don't get is I'm a mass murderer and I'm terribly sorry. Do with me as you wish.
I feel like you just made the greatest defense of Hannah Arendt's finality of evil in this recitation of, an insight into Eichmann's attempt to protect himself somehow. I mean, these were very energetic, but, infantile in some way, self-deceiving in some way, banal man. So I would like to hear more about why you reject Hannah Arendt's phrase, what you see there that I'm not seeing.
What she was saying is he wasn't basically ideologically driven, and Eichmann was convinced about the ideology of the regime, that what they were doing had an ideological cause. He was trying to portray himself in court as the minor bureaucrat that simply was carrying out the routines and obeying the policies of his superiors. That this had no there was no conviction, ideological belief behind it. And that we know from the Argentine papers, of course, that he is a convinced Nazi. He does see himself at war with the Jews, and the destruction of the Jews is necessary for the survival of the Germans. That's the world he saw. That to be a crusader in a race war is not banal in my mind. There's certainly banal aspects to him. And he certainly magnified those and hid others in order to magnify the banal side of things. But at his core, he is a convinced Nazi. And that, to me, means that I have to put him in a different category. He is an ideological warrior.
But Arendt said finality of evil. The evil is there.
Oh, yes.
But he's a little putz. That's what he's trying to save his ass, right?
Well, the evil is there, and he's not a little putz. He's a big putz.
I think we can all agree on that. Do you want to?
In the Argentine papers, Eichmann discusses about how he was in the physical custody of the Americans post-war, and how he fooled the Americans and got away from them. Considering the efforts that the Americans went to find him post-war, what does the actual documentation show? Have we located the American documentation that he was in American custody and how he got away?
I think he was in an American camp. Lots of people walked out of these camps. That it was not hard to, this was not a major achievement to escape from one of these camps. When he began to hear that his name was had actually surfaced in the Nuremberg testimony, that's when he skedaddled and took on a new identity and was working in the boondocks in northern Germany. And very, very careful. The discipline by which he never contacted his family. From the time of the end of the war until he got to Argentina and arranged, they never knew. I mean, he was so careful at that point. By the time he's talking to Sassen, he's getting very careless. And here's a man and a whole audience giving these presentations in '67. This was a man that didn't even let his family know he's alive between 46 and 50. So progressively, I think he chafed at his anonymity, and I think he became more and more comfortable in the fact that in Argentina, clearly the German embassy knew he was there. Clearly, I mean, when his family comes, they come and register as Vera Eichmann and Nicholas Eichmann and the names of the family, and then move in with Ricardo Clement. I mean, how much does it take to figure out that, well, maybe you ought to look at this guy? And clearly they didn't want to and chose not to. And so when Fritz Bauer, the Frankfurt attorney, got the word of it, he didn't tell the German Secret Service, he told the Israelis, because he didn't trust the Foreign Office or the embassy in Buenos Aires to possibly pull this off, that they would pull clear warning rather than arrest him.
In fact, those major escalation points. Can you tell us more, maybe what was discovered since, what was his initial death, what was his assignment?
What did he actually do? Yeah. Actually, there's sort of 3 stages to his career. Well, actually maybe 4. In 1935, 36, 37, he's in what I would call a think tank in the Sicherheitsdienst, where they're trying to figure out what does it mean to solve the Jewish question. And this is where they're devising the notion of forced immigration. And when there's no more Jews living in Germany, then the Jewish problem is solved. He becomes the practitioner of that from 38 to 40 when he goes first to Vienna and then sets up a Jewish immigration program and then is sent on to Prague to do it there and then back to Berlin. In the fall of 39, he becomes Heydrich's advisor-in-chief on the Jewish question, but also, as the man expert now in ethnic cleansing, in charge of the driving of Poles and Jews out of the annexed territories of Western Poland in order to make them less Polish, less Jewish, and more German. And the goal ultimately was to basically cleanse this area of 8 million Jews and Poles and repopulate it entirely with Germans. And it is Eichmann and his experts who are moving people. So he is an ethnic cleanser as well as an advisor to Heydrich in 42 to 41. He isn't involved particularly with the Einsatz group in the organization of the invasion of the East. But once you're going to expand the final solution from the Jews east of the Molotov-Ribbentrop line to the west, and where you can't send firing squads of Jews, you have to send the Jews to the death camps, then he is the mover. He is the man who is going to organize all the transports from Greece to Norway, and that he will be the one in charge of who gets deported when and in what sequence. And so he, in that sense, I mean, the bulk of the victims of the Holocaust are Poland and to the east. And the people he actually put on trains then are about 1 million people. He didn't, in fact, kill 5 million Jews. He was boasting beyond that. Because the Polish Jews are deported from ghettos in a different operation. That's not Eichmann's operation. So basically all the Jews to the west of Poland, from Norway to Greece, are people that he put on trains to the death camps. And that was his key role.
Just a clarification, what was he doing at those sites? Was he sent there to report back to Heydrich? How was he doing that?
Or what was he doing at these various sites where he traveled? He claims he was simply supposed to report back. I think in part he was to make sure they were doing it. And when he goes to Minsk, the question is, people didn't want to get these transports coming in. And so the order is, okay, we'll make space for them. You don't have space, we'll shoot the Jews there. Who's there to make sure they do that? And when the transports come, they are received. I think that was the key to being at Minsk. And then again, before the Wannsee Conference, one of the sentences of the Wannsee Conference was they discussed various possible solutions. Well, he's been to Minsk and watched the shooting. He's been there to see the gassing. He and one other person have actually, Lana from Latvia, have actually seen the killings and can report to the others how these different possibilities are. So yes, he's there to be the reporter on site and to bring that back to Berlin.
Yes. You speak about the fact that he was a convinced Nazi, that he just wasn't this guy who was caught as a bureaucrat. This whole notion that it was his responsibility to protect Germany against these superior intellectually superior but very dangerous, destructive Jews. This notion, did he truly believe this with a conviction without doubt, or did he have some insight into the fact that this was a massive projection?
I think I will take him at his word about what he said in the 50s. It coincides with other things he says earlier. In that sense, he does see this war as a war against Germans and Jews, which there can only be one winner. And that's his framework. This notion of Jews being the superior intellects, that's a little twist that you don't find in much Nazi stuff. Usually the Jews are portrayed as the great threat, not because they're intellectually superior, but on the one hand, they're going to poison and contaminate and dilute the blood of pure Germans. And pure blood is strong, mixed blood is weak. That was their assumption. And the second was that Jews spread the subversive ideas that will cripple Germany's ability to wage the no-holds-barred race war against everybody else for Lebensraum. Because Jews are the spreaders of, these are the various Jewish conspiracies, the spreaders of Christianity, which is love thy neighbor and turn the other cheek. Then the spreaders of liberalism, which is equality before the law, and the spreaders of Marxism, which is brotherhood of workers unite, you know no countries. So these were all in Nazi minds, the great Jewish conspiracies of equality that threaten the Nazi view, which is the greatest myth of human equality, that you're fighting for German superiority and everybody else has to be conquered and destroyed, and Germans are going to continue to grow and prosper. So the Jewish threat is usually portrayed as one of a dual threat of blood subversion and intellectual subversion. This Eichmann touch that, you know, they're intellectually superior, that is rare. That seems to be his own little cuckoo idea.
No, I don't know if there's going to be some sort of connection in a way with something here, but actually the notion that there is a link, of course, between, and Hitler believes to a Teutonic link or something between England and Germany. And when Bram Stoker wrote the novel Dracula at the turn of the century then, there was a feeling that the Eastern Europeans were going to come into England and contaminate the blood. And Dracula was a metaphor of this. And what's interesting is here you find the Nazis emerging with the notices like a Teutonic-like state being contaminated by Eastern people in the blood, that the blood would be contaminated. There seems to be some sort of parallel. I don't know if there's any possible connection.
All we have to look to is the American 1924 immigration laws that set quotas based upon what your percentage of the population already was, because you wanted to make sure there was a permanent preservation of a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant majority from white Northern Europe, and that new people coming in like Poles and Italians and Irish and Jews would never be able to swamp the good white Anglo-Saxon Protestant majority. I mean, this was a common notion that isn't restricted to the Nazis. This was the self-evident to lots of people in the United States that created a whole immigration law around that notion.
Who was a fan of here?
Very interesting. I happen to be a documentary filmmaker, and my cousin was a documentary filmmaker who did the Warsaw Ghetto film with the BBC and discovered Jürgen Stroop's diaries, which were made for Himmler, about the final solution of the Warsaw Ghetto. And I've always wondered about Eichmann, you know, and my gut feeling was that he had OCD to be able to be a dispatcher, to organize all this stuff. What do we know about his early childhood?
Excuse me, what is OCD?
OCD, you mean the definition?
Compulsive disorder, when you're obsessed, it's obsessive compulsive disorder.
Obsessive compulsive disorder.
So you're like so obsessed with things.
Yeah. I would say we don't have any evidence of that in his early career, because he drifts around from career to career. So up until his breakthrough in Vienna, he is a relative non-entity. And when he goes to the security place in our security service at 35, he's one of the few there that isn't a college-educated, degree-holding, intellectual. He's sort of the only man off the street that joins them. So he's a fish out of water until it becomes the issue of practice as opposed to writing memo reports. And it turns out in practice, he's much more practical and efficient. And he is also extremely good at manipulating people. His ability to deal with various Jewish leaders, and he, again, in his Argentine papers, he boasts about that he caught the fish by the hook, he knew how to play the fish, was his metaphor for, and then later, of course, he says, oh, we were all equals and colleagues in a common purpose. Well, it's not the image that he gives in the Argentine portion. So he had certain talents that turned out to be exactly the right blend. Some attention to detail, but certainly an ability to manipulate people and an ability to organize that caused this kind of rocket career from out of obscurity to suddenly being at the right hand of Reinhard Heydrich.
I don't know how much time we have left.
One more question.
Okay, one more question. No problem.
How well known was he, if at all, to the German public, who at the beginning of the war I understood were not so crazy about killing the Jews, and of course as things went on they became so desperate that they probably wanted to kill the Jews?
I don't think he's in kind of household word. I mean, certainly when you go to the Nuremberg rallies, the big Nazis are trotted up there. A person of his rank, lieutenant colonel of the SS, is not going to be up there. So he's known to people who are involved in running in the occupied territories, particularly the attempt to Germanize the annexed Polish territories, certainly to people who are running the occupation of Vienna in 1938. But he's at that level where I don't think he has a public visage, or very little of one, certainly in comparison to what we now historically look back on and see as an importance that would not have been perceptible at that period, because we don't know what's going to come out of it. I mean, essentially we can look back and realize how key what Eichmann did in Vienna was, because we know what it leads to. But at the time, he would not have been perceived as a particularly leading figure. No. He always insisted he had no material concerns, and because so many of the Nazis were so corrupt and self-enriching, I think he made some extraordinary account at the end of the war, and I hope it's not an apocryphal story because it's too good to be one. It shouldn't be. But it was something like, he has his conscience clean because they can hold him accountable. He can account for every penny in his ledger. He never stole anything, and so he's clean.
He's a murderer without a
Yeah. So he did have that view that he was above and less corrupt than others, and he probably was not wrong in that regard. I mean, I don't know for sure, but we don't seem to have him taking bribes, say, in the way that others do, like Vyslachenyi in Czechoslovakia, one of his men there, and that part of his notion of why he was the idealist was that he wasn't as corrupt as other Nazis.
Again, thank you so much.